Thank you, Cardinal Parolin, for actually having disposed of my paper. You have said all the key points. Specifically, if I'm going to say anything original, it's that the marginalized may be marginalized on various dimensions. But I want to concentrate on one in particular this morning, which is political participation in politics. And I define this, for clarity, as having a say. To participate is to have a say in political decision-making. And it can be either politically authorized by reform, or it can be grabbed by revolution or uprisings. So I do not want to conflate political participation with other dimensions that contribute towards marginalization, such as inequalities, which we have dwelt upon, or any other of the distributions of socially scarce resources. If there is a theoretical fulcrum to this paper, it is perhaps my usual one, back reference to David Lockwood's seminal article of 1964, where he pointed out very clearly that change comes most readily when there is low social integration and low system integration coinciding with one another. What he doesn't do, I think he's absolutely right in that statement, and I think this is the situation we are in today, but what he doesn't do is to talk about the processes of change. And he does therefore not specify the conditions under which changes are brought about from the top down or from the bottom up. And that's what I want to focus on this morning, because I think there has been a huge change in the processes involved. And I'm going to take a rather strange method of proceeding with this. I want to make 5 points about changes during the 20th century in politics that affect participation, and then I want to work backwards up them to see what these changes have as their effects for bottom-up change introduced by the marginalized. So the first point, for those of us who are old enough to call ourselves baby boomers, quite a few of us who were born just after the war, when we went to our various first degrees in social sciences, there were 2 very well entrenched accounts on offer as explanations for why there was marginalization. Both of them hung upon the picturing of social stratification being triangular. In other words, a very small elite at the apex and a large proletariat, if you like, at the bottom. So at that time, many sociologists, political scientists, etc., were unapologetic neo-Marxists, and they viewed the failure of the exploited working class to transform itself from a class in itself to a class for itself as being the generic cause of their exclusion. And therefore, their certitude was that participatory change could only come from bottom-up contestation on the part of the workers treated as a pretty homogeneous block of people with a pretty homogeneous set of grievances because of their non-participation. But on the other hand, we were also exposed simultaneously to the liberal economists who were equally convinced of the opposite, namely that every working man would be advanced and would participate thanks to the beneficent trickle-down effect, working from the top down, not the bottom up, that would surely prove to be in the interests of all. Now, there's no need to labor the fact that the rising of the proletariat never happened, and equally that a rising sea of affluence did not lift all boats. In other words, neither of the things we were brought up on were much use for explaining marginalization today. But these were changing times. And the second point is that after these proclamations, we had the rise and the demise of social democracy. After the Second World War, after centuries of conflict, with elites attempting to limit the political participation of others in order to be able to regulate society, and the popular classes seeking to extend participatory democracy in order to regulate the elites, this post-war formula was issued in, which did indeed provide a golden interlude of perhaps 30 years in which the neo was inserted into liberalism, in which neoliberalism existed alongside social democracy and citizenship and the welfare state. This was the formula that took the revolutionary edge off the potential for class conflict. And this compromise lasted for 3 decades, and it hinged on one thing in particular. We were still in a period of the nation state, and within each nation state, the state of the elites mattered to the workers, just as the state of the working classes mattered to the elites. It was a time of mutual regulation because of mutual dependency of these two groups on one another. Their ancient battles going back to the 16th, 17th century were not over. The accounts were not settled. But each acted as a constraint on the other and prevented them from going too far. And this seemed pretty stable at the time. There was one condition that this mutual regulation depended upon, and that was the nation state remaining, metaphorically speaking, the outer skin of each society. And this, of course, was multinationalism. Multinational capitalism was not to last. And as it gave way, what happened was the birth of the multinational corporation, operating in different countries throughout the world, and therefore indifferent. This is what spelt the end of mutual regulation, indifferent to the state of their employees wherever they set up factories or enterprises or whatever. If the employees showed that they were discontented, it was very easy for the multinational company to move on somewhere else where there was not worker organization or anything of that kind. So, in a nutshell, the more globalization you got, the less mutual regulation you had between the two sides of the employment divide. As time went on, there's a sort of recognition that the shape of social stratification was changing, that it was no longer the triangle, but in the 70s was becoming diamond-shaped. A smaller elite, a smaller proletariat, and a mass of people in the middle, which led some to coin the phrase, "We are all middle class now."
Sorry, Mrs. Archer. Before you go to the third point, I have to
Oh, I'm so sorry. Certainly.
Just sorry for interrupting
No.
you.
I'm sure you have had enough.
No, it's not a question that I have another name.
Well, I'm not quite sure what the protocol is after a cardinali break. Do I go on or do I wait for a chance? Yeah, just go on. Okay. So the new mantra that developed on the basis of this idea that stratification was now diamond-shaped was that we were all middle class now. And there was some truth in that for some people. It was a bigger middle class. I remember very well going to school along streets in which people owned their own houses for the first time, had their first cars. And this has led many to talk about the privatization of the middle class, no longer interested in political participation, totally preoccupied with their new material possessions and some of their life chances. Because in this period, these were the beneficiaries of the new welfare state. These were the beneficiaries of occupational permanence. Sorry, I don't mean permanence, occupational security and occupational promotion. And it was a very common topic of conversation, you know, among the managers of enterprises. You know, when do you expect your next promotion? What was taken completely for granted was that each year you had an increment in your income. And in terms of this privatization argument, this is what they looked forward to. How would they spend that increment? So we also found this to be the first class that was taking its first plane flights, having its first introduction, certainly if you came from a little island like the United Kingdom, to foreign countries. And it made a huge difference to politics. We had the development of what Pierpaolo came to call lib-lab politics. The alternation of either parties or coalitions in government in which the lib parties favoured the free economy and the lab parties supported progressively more diluted versions of socialism. So it's action by the state or action by the market. Now, what I want to argue is that the next stage of development moved from lib-lab to centrism. Lib-lab had certainly dominated for the 4 decades after the Second World War. It was in the 80s, and it's amazing how often 1980 has been signalled in this meeting as a transition point, because it certainly was, at least the beginning of one. And the move to centrism, to me, is extremely important. It meant that, how can one put it, that instead of awaiting for your kind of government getting progressively more diluted as both lib and lab to come into power, actually political power itself was changing with the beginnings of the financialization of capitalism, with a shift to how people were governed. And an argument I don't have time to develop here, but it's there in one of my last books, is that it issued in progressively politics without vision, politics without commitment, and a reliance on a novel form of bureaucratic regulation for control. A bureaucratic regulation which was anormative. There was what Doug Porpler calls a macro-moral disconnect, summed up in the words of Tony Blair's advisor: we don't do religion here, we don't do ideology here. What we do is we regulate people, we coordinate people by a plethora of bureaucratic regulations applying to each and every social institution, each regulator unconnected to other regulators. So in a sense, centrism means there is actually no political center to gain participation in. You gain participation in the health service, in education, in all the other social institutions. But all of them visionless, all of them accepting the end of CAC, command and control, in which everything came from the top down through legislation. And instead of that, we have bureaucratic regulation which promotes coordination but does nothing whatsoever for cooperation. And it does nothing for linking the marginalized together in protest against their exclusion. There is nothing that makes those who are discontented with education join hands with those who are discontented with health or income distribution or whatever it may be. And given this, the marginalized had less and less participatory voice. I mean, let's not forget that throughout Europe, the birth of syndicalism and trade unionism was a tremendous source of voice for the then working classes. At times, they had voice without participation, but the voice preceded the participation. Now, they have no participation and they have no voice. They have no role whatsoever in the new regulatory bodies. And these regulatory bodies operate at the meso level, and as Emmanuel Lazega has put this very, very economically, the lack of a meso level constituted by organizations, institutions, and associations is the biggest blockage to participation or barrier to our understanding of its effects. So what was it that fragmented this meso level and went so far that by the time we came to the financial crisis, the borderland between the old middle classes and the old working classes had been completely blurred. There's no knowing where one stopped, the other began, who was moving up a bit, down a bit. In fact, this dreadful word in English was coined, precariety, which really doesn't exist. But it's signaling every job became precarious. Precarious is a perfectly decent word. And this is what gave rise, of course, to the exaggerated statement, slogan, we are the 99%. We are not the 1% of the rich. It's an exaggeration, of course. The 1% is actually 10%, but you've had all the figures this week on that. But indeed, it did become more and more fragmented, different lifestyles, different remunerations, insecurity. No, you could not talk any longer about what you were going to buy next year with your next increment, because you didn't even know that you'd have a job next year. And this is a classical illustration of what happens in politics when there is low social integration and low systemic integration. You get, fifthly, the decline of social movements in Europe. Those grand social movements that had instituted the trade unions and even the confederations of industry. So, if that had been their origins of success, participatory success, why did the effects of austerity not produce similar effects, new movements? Well, as I was saying yesterday, these were highly regulated social orders where values were excluded from public life, where we don't do religion, we don't do utopia, we don't do ideology. And I would say therefore, but I would have to take some time to justify my therefore, which I don't have, the Occupy movements to me were howls of protest, but they were not the origins of social movements. And despite this long book of Manuel Castells about outrage and hope, I don't see them having led from the outrage to any realistic prospect of hope coming from them. So what are the prospects of change from the bottom up? All of this so far has been talking about consequences of bottom-down processes. Well, as we ended yesterday discussing, thanks to Professor Lee's paper, the social media, one view of that is his optimistic one, but another view of that is our pessimistic one, that the effect of digitalized media has contributed towards distracted people, which you can see every time you take a plane or a train. What are they doing? All of them. And progressively, the social media have stopped being a stupid thing, trivial thing for kids, and they've become a trivial thing for adults. And they have broken through what was called in the United States the blue rinse barrier, or the silver top barrier in the UK. Retired people are possessors of mobiles. In fact, there are only 3% of us in the UK who do not possess a mobile and don't want to possess a mobile and don't want to play with one incessantly. Now, why do we call this leading to distracted people? Because they have less and less time to consider reflexively themselves in relation to their social circumstances. Why do some of us say it leads to fragile movements? Because, as again we were saying yesterday, these atrocities that occur, like the Charlie Hebdo one that I was referring to, they are atrocities, the assassinations are inhuman, but they are quite different from the atrocities that lay behind the anti-apartheid movement and the civil rights movement, which were so realistically concentrated upon black well-being that they, in all its dimensions, or nearly all its dimensions, that it couldn't go away. The death of one minor French intellectual satirical magazine could go away, and did. And there's another qualitative aspect to this too, which we studied, particularly one of our colleagues, Ismail Alamoudi, studied, the Geneva Occupy movement, where it became more and more appreciated how difficult the economics of austerity and counter-austerity actually were. And they broke up from being a camper protest. They retreated back to the seminar rooms in the university and tried to get their heads around things like hedge funds, sale of derivatives, etc., etc., etc. This, in turn, led to their demise. People just gave up. The economics were too difficult. So one of the consequences of this failed attempt at new social movements was there was nothing to articulate the missing middle class, the missing meso level. And this really enabled heartless humanism to rule within government. So the cultural side, I mean, we looked at the structural side so far. Cultural side I won't have time to go into, but it meant that parties of all persuasions were talking the same rhetoric. Or if you want to be Foucauldian, there was a centrist political discourse. You can hear it today. It's absolute nonsense in terms of having any relation to reality, but you can hear it in Britain with right-wing conservative politicians talking about the misery of the proletariat. Well, they don't use that word, of course. The misery of the people in relation to the health service, what we must do to have an egalitarian education for everybody. Okay, I need one more minute, maybe two. What's happened is that the mutual regulation between the systemic and the social had vanished. Yes, monsieur, but I had a cardinal to get up for. And therefore, where can we look for any hope? I think there are two sources, and I'll finish just by drawing attention to these two sources. Sources of hope for bottom-up change that involve agency, culture, and structure without eliding them or conflating them. And just to name them, we have, on the one hand, and starting first, we have the Green Movement. The Green Movement, which did accomplish this bottom-up transition from some people at the bottom objecting to our unfriendly relationships with nature and forming organizations, the best known of which is Greenpeace at the meso level, and then managing to make the link up to the macro level and become political parties. All right, they're small throughout Europe, and I'm only talking about Europe. They're very small, but they are important. They are now recognized coalition partners, and they have their own voice. They have not been without influence, and they have not been without influence in both academia and in the church. And I want to point to the church as our second possible conduit from the bottom upwards to the macro level. The church has become a social movement in our time in a way which is quite different from the power, the influence, the moral authority that it had undoubtedly in the past. Some people object to this profoundly, but we have had magnificent interventions on behalf of the trafficked, on behalf of asylum seekers, on behalf at breakfast in the lobby in Santa Marta one morning. We often cross paths but have no chance to speak. Papa Francisco banged me on the back and said, "Buena trabajo, ma los cartoneros." And I went running to Marcelo and said, "What does cartoneros mean?" It turned out the best English translation was scavengers. So he is always on every trip going for the poorest of the poor. And in this case, he was setting a great challenge to us, which this meeting is really here to represent. Not, let's have another description of top-down reforms. Let's try and conceptualize something which is incredibly difficult, bottom-up reforms that would include the welfare of the scavengers. Thank you.
Very good.